Welcome back, my good-looking listeners, to the China History Podcast. This is Laszlo Montgomery bringing you part 7 of this CHP series covering the history of Singapore. We got as far as the founding of the Malayan Federation last time. We looked at the mess that was the Malayan Union and the formation of the United Malays National Organization. Now we're going to look at the political scene in Singapore and how the transition of government control went from British colonial to Singaporean self-rule. When we lowered the curtain in part 6 with the founding of UMNO, we saw how they rode that wave of Malayan nationalism all the way to self-rule and independence. And the matter of Singapore and whether or not they were part of the scene happening in Malaya was a hotly debated topic. I've already touched on some of the main sticking points. The racial, social, and cultural differences weren't easy to reconcile. We see it in our own day where we live, so no one can point a finger at Malaysians and Singaporeans. The deal breaker was the additional ethnic Chinese who, through their numbers and the votes they collectively had, were in a position to shape government policy and control the destiny of the ethnic Malays by turning them into a minority in their own country. The Malayan leaders had their reasons. As an outsider looking in, I see the obvious. The way history unfolded, as we've seen from these past episodes, no small number of Chinese migrants fell in love with Malaya after migrating there and decided to stay. The Malay people, after all those centuries going back to 1511 of being under the thumb of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Japanese, and the British, were finally being fast-tracked for independence and self-rule. If Singapore got mixed in with Malaya, well, that would mean, politically, that just by sheer numbers, the Chinese Malayans might be able to control the government, make the laws, and have a say in how society was to be run. And the Malayan people's way of life that was steeped in millennia-old traditions, their religion, their sensibilities, everything was potentially in jeopardy of being determined by people who, culturally, weren't like them. So this matter had to be handled with care, and for the time being, Singapore remained its own thing, a British Crown colony, and separate from the newly independent Federation of Malaya. Let me just talk first about the Maria Hertogh incident and use that as a rather high-profile case that presents the sensitivity of this matter. This wasn't a conflict between Malay and Chinese. It was a conflict between Malay and European, or as it was also framed, between Islam and Christianity. So Maria Hertogh was born in Java, near Bandung, to a Eurasian mother of Scottish-Javanese descent, and a Dutch father who served in the Dutch army in Indonesia. And she was baptized a Catholic, and this was in March of 1937. And whenever we hear that year, 1937, we know what was in store for the Asian continent and the island colonies and nations. So she was born at a difficult time in history. In 1941, her father, early on, was rounded up and interned by the Japanese and sent to a POW camp in Japan till 1945. Little Maria was handed over to a local Muslim family to be looked after and was raised in the Muslim faith and culture. Her name was changed, and at such a young age, this was all she knew growing up. When the war ended, she was 8 and only spoke Malay and had spent those years being raised in her foster mother's hometown in Terengganu, one of the states in Malaysia's northeast. The war disrupted quite a few lives, the Hertogh families included. Maria's father was released from the POW camp and reunited with her mother. Long story short, since the end of the war, Mr. and Mrs. Hertogh tried to locate Maria, but as you could imagine, in those years immediately following Japan's surrender, it took a while for families and friends to reunite. They worked with authorities in Singapore and Java and with several NGOs like the Red Cross, but hadn't been able to find out where Maria had disappeared to. And then in September 1949, they tracked her down to a village in Malaya, and there started the controversy. You know what's going to happen. This was predictable, especially considering the years, 1949, 1950, with Merdeka on everyone's mind and the share price of Malay nationalistic pride at an all-time high. Little Maria was raised a Muslim and had grown up completely ensconced within Malay culture. She only spoke Malay, and other than her Caucasian appearance, she was no different from any 12 or 13-year-old girl who grew up in Malaya. So, who should she go live with? Return to her Catholic parents, learn Dutch, and grow up in the society that her parents lived in? Or leave things as they were, in the care of people who loved her equally, but who lived within the cultural confines of the Orang Melayu, the Malay people? Maria's parents wanted her back. They didn't ask for the Japanese to invade Java and turn their lives upside down and tear their family apart. Their family got wrecked, but they survived the ordeal, and the people who cared for Maria since she was not even 5 years old loved her as their own. They, too, were unwilling to give her up. So it was left up to the courts. And early into this fracas in the making, Maria was taken away by the authorities while the two sides settled this in the courts. Now, Maria herself had made it abundantly clear she didn't want to leave her foster family. She wanted to keep things exactly as they were. And this was the only family she had ever known. But the courts decided differently, and Maria was handed back to her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hertogh. And the tearful and heart-wrenching scene following the court's decision was captured by photographers, and the whole tearful moment of Maria being taken away from her Malay foster parents and being forced into the arms of her Dutch natural parents, well, you might say, touched the hearts of more Muslim people than those residing in Malaya. The case was appealed, and Maria was placed in a convent until everything got sorted out. And then on August 1st, 1950, Maria, 13 at the time, was married to a Malay man, 21 years of age. And this added another thin layer of complication to the Hertogh's case. So was Maria's tearful exclamation on the record that she was a Muslim and had made the choice to stay with her husband. The case was attracting a lot of worldwide attention, and with both sides wagging their finger at each other, demanding to know what right the other had to think the way they did. Even back then, many people close to the situation knew this was heading for an unpleasant showdown. By now, the media coverage, as much as it could be in 1950, which was still considerable, was huge. This was especially true in predominantly Muslim countries, and you could guess whose side they were on. The judge in Singapore called this marriage a legal ploy arranged hastily by Marie's foster mother for the sake of keeping her in Malaya. And after all the emotional evidence was presented by both sides, the judge ruled in favor of Maria's natural parents. The court determined that, considering all the circumstances of the case, her natural parents still had legal parental custody. As you could imagine, quite a scene was made, and Maria was taken from her wailing foster mother, and with her husband assuring her he would fight for her, Maria was whisked away to a convent where her mother joined her shortly thereafter. Even without the sewerage of our modern-day media world, word traveled fast, and depending on who was spreading the word, the details were spun in such a way as to further inflame an already very volatile matter. Even back then, the optics of being taken away from this Muslim Malay life she had grown up in and being taken away against her will, crying and carrying on, and then stashed away in a convent, it didn't look good. Political and religious leaders, they didn't call for a crusade or a jihad, but the whole matter was framed as an Islam versus Christianity thing. The final appeal to the case was heard on December 11, 1950. Crowds had gathered in the thousands around the Supreme Court awaiting the outcome. The judge ruled in favor of the Hertoghs again and threw out the appeal from Maria's foster family. That's when riots broke out, and they lasted for 3 days. A curfew was put in place for 2 weeks. Europeans got roughed up in public to varying degrees, and a lot of extra steam was being released into the air, and there were many ethnic Malay policemen in Singapore who were accused of looking the other way when Europeans were being preyed upon. By the time order was restored on December 13th, 18 people had been killed, 7 of them European or Eurasian. 2 police lost their lives, and 9 others among the mob were shot in the disturbance. And when it all ended, 173 people had been injured, 119 vehicles set on fire or damaged, and 2 buildings were torched. And of the 200 people arrested, about half of them were convicted. There was an inquiry. Some of what was said was that, all things considered, the government and law enforcement, well, they should have seen this coming and didn't prepare for that eventuality. And from this point forward, everyone had to admit that this matter of racial and religious feelings and customs had to be acknowledged, and matters like this had to be handled with particular care. The media was also excoriated for fanning the fires and, as the press is known to do, make things worse than they needed to be. The next day, following the court's decision, Maria Hertogh and her family flew to the Netherlands. She learned to speak Dutch and became accustomed to Dutch culture, but she continued to live a Malay lifestyle. She didn't go on to have a happy ending. After all this trauma and going through it at such a young age, Maria faced more than her share of difficulties in life. 3 marriages, 4 if you count the one when she was 13, and she had 10 children. Not as many as my mother-in-law, but still a lot by any reckoning. She passed away from leukemia in July 2009 at the age of 72. This was an early case that didn't do a good job handling the matter of the religious and racial sensitivities of such a multi-ethnic population. The Maria Hertogh case and the riots that resulted went on to become a symbol of colonial injustice and the seething tensions that simmered between the different communities that populated the Malay Peninsula. And moving forward, the government had to keep this in mind. So, last time I introduced some Malay politics and the forces that led to the founding of the United Malays National Organization. They're still around today, but since 2018, they're no longer the dominant political party in Malaysia. So let's move on to the political scene in Singapore. And I suppose there's no better place to start than to examine the life of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. He was born on September 16th, 1923. Sharing a birthday with a few notable figures from Chinese history, the elixir-loving Ming Jiajing Emperor and the Qing Daoguang Emperor. And Mr. Lee also shares a birthday with none other than the Hongxian Emperor himself, Yuan Shikai. The Hakka people proudly claim Lee Kuan Yew as one of their own. Both of his parents, mother Chua Jim Nyo and father Lee Jin Kun, were of Hakka and Peranakan origin. His father's family came from Tangxi Village, Dabu County, located adjacent to the worldwide Hakka headquarters of Meizhou, Guangdong Province. Mrs. Lee, aside from her famous son, achieved renown in her own right with the publication in the 1970s of the great Mrs. Lee's Cookbook, which introduced the delights of her Nonya cuisine. I'll quickly run through Lee Kuan Yew's bio, and then we'll come to his entree into the political ring. Surprisingly, Lee Kuan Yew, or Harry Lee Kuan Yew, as he was known for his first couple decades, grew up in a family where English was the spoken language at home. He also learned Cantonese and Malay. He spoke neither Hakka nor Mandarin and didn't start to learn how to speak those languages until he entered politics in the 1950s. He and his future wife, Geok Choo, or Ke Yu Zhi, both attended the prestigious, I think the stereotypical adjective is, Raffles Institution and Raffles College. And both of these overachievers, like everyone else in Singapore, had to put their lives on hold as soon as Japan commenced all the actions that I discussed last episode. Mr. Lee was 19 at the time, and the future Mrs. Lee was 21. Because of the war, they had to put their university plans on hold. I mentioned during the Suk Ching massacre, the Kempe Tai were looking for chaps just like Lee Kuan Yew. He fit the bill as far as they were concerned. And Lee was able to dodge them until the worst had ended. The Japanese did catch up with him and sent Lee Kuan Yew to Sentosa Island to listen to Allied radio stations and report on anything useful to the Japanese war effort. But then came the end of the war, and for everyone who survived it, life went on. At the end of 1946, Lee Kuan Yew and Geok Choo headed to England to go study law at Cambridge. Kuan Yew at Fitzwilliam College and Geok Choo at Girton College. Lee didn't enter politics while studying in England, but he did become quite politically aware. He and other interested overseas students vigorously debated the future of Malaya in a group called the Malayan Forum. Though not a communist himself, Lee found at that time the only viable answer to ousting the British from Malaya was the MCP, the Malayan Communist Party. With the head start they had, going back to the 40s, he saw them as much more than the bandits and riffraff they were described as in the press. Lee returned to Singapore in 1951, and along with Geok Choo, they joined a local law firm and continued to explore Singapore politics. The two had tied the knot a year before in 1950, and the first big moment came in 1948 with the first ever elections that were held to choose a legislative assembly. Like their Hong Kong friends, Singaporeans back in 1948 weren't terribly engaged in politics, and very few were clamoring for democracy. For the 1948 election, of the 940,000 people living in Singapore at the time, only about 200,000 were registered to vote. Only British subjects were eligible. And of those, only 14,126 bothered to show up and exercise their right to cast a ballot. A new political party, I mentioned them last time in Part 6, the Singapore Progressive Party, was introduced to the public. They were not that popular, and many saw them as a front for the Brits and the ruling educated elites in society. It was a decidedly pro-British party with no itch to fast-track independence, and without any mass support, they still managed to win half the seats in the election. During this early period, for lack of any other popular choices, the SPP would remain the dominant party in Singapore politics. And by 1954, though, the will of the masses was indicating that the pace of changes being offered by Progressive Party leaders were running a little too slow. But in 1954, when elections were announced for the following year in April 1955, that changed everything. I know it's hard to look around Singapore today and picture it with all these squalid residential developments, desperately poor people living in kampongs, and an utter lack of essential services for the poor. But 1950 Singapore, despite all the wealth pouring into the place, well, the lower classes were not that well taken care of. Between 1947 and 1957, Singapore saw a 54% growth in population, and not many of those had country club memberships. Back then, Singapore's masses saw the same old thing the Hong Kong people were seeing with their own eyes. The economy was booming. Lots of millionaires, elites, and insiders were getting fabulously wealthy, and none of this prosperity seemed to be trickling down to the bottom 90% of society. For them, prosperity wasn't even just around the corner. The Singapore Laobaixing only knew from unemployment, low and stagnant wages, no workers' rights, limited access to education. Disease was rampant. In 1959, there will even be a smallpox outbreak. It usually doesn't take much more than that to cause decent folk to lose hope in having a seat at the table of a prosperous Singapore. In 1951, the government established the Central Provident Fund. That's sort of like our American Social Security program. And in 1954, a new law passed that called for mandatory military service for all Chinese males. And this led to student acts of civil disobedience as well as protests that turned violent. And Lee Kuan Yew took on many of the cases of jailed students and fought for the protesters, establishing his bona fides among these young voters and future voters. And I didn't mention this, but up in Malaya, the communists were waging a very deadly and disruptive war. And with all this popular dissatisfaction in Singapore, the Malayan Communist Party saw ample opportunities for recruitment. So you could say at a time of this growing political turmoil and public dissatisfaction, the British showed everyone what decent chaps they were and announced these new elections. And they took a leap of faith by greatly expanding the voting franchise. And many saw this as an opening. In looking back, it appeared that the government in Singapore misjudged the sentiment of the people. There was this belief that, well, although they weren't perfect, the Singapore Progressive Party had the best interests of the people in mind. So with this mindset, the government saw no danger in expanding the voting franchise throughout Singapore and making this 1955 election something truly democratic. The main figures who emerged around this time who led the opposition against the Singapore Progressive Party were Lee Kuan Yew and his People's Action Party, and the other was David Saul Marshall. He came from an Iraqi Jewish background, served in the legislative and executive councils, had been a ranking member in the SPP, and a very well-known and colorful lawyer who knew his rhetoric inside out. He led the party he co-founded, the Labour Front. The Labour Front was founded in July 1954 by David Marshall and two others. And they called for uniting with Malaya and made a lot of pro-Malaya statements. They were nationalist, anti-colonialist, and were all about power to the people, right on. Lee Kuan Yew didn't do it all by himself, but he co-founded the People's Action Party, or PAP, on November 21st, 1954. They shared many of the same values of their rival Labour Front Party. They were also anti-colonialist, pro-nationalist, of course, and they too sought a merger with the Malayan Federation and making Malay the national language with Chinese and Tamil as official languages. They were also very pro-business, pro-industrialization. And two of Lee's right-hand men were Lim Chin Siong and Fong Swee Suan. More of them in a moment. They were unionist firebrands who had played roles in the student protests of 1954 and formed the leftist wing of the PAP. Back in 1952, Lee Kuan Yew had caught his first big break. This had to do with Singapore's first major incident of labor unrest since the last election in 1948. It involved workers from the postal union who were striking for better pay and working conditions. Lee took this case on with the full knowledge that hitching his political wagon to the unions was the quickest way to start building a mass party and make inroads amongst the people. The victory he won for the postal union workers turned him into a celebrity of sorts. It won him accolades as a man of the people. And he did it again with workers from the Hock Lee Bus Company when they went on strike. This one got out of hand on May 12, 1954, when a massive crowd of students and workers protested outside the gates of the bus company. As the crowd grew unruly and refused to disperse, water cannons were used. And as we know from recent news, when you get hit with one of those things, operating at 100 to 200 psi, serious injuries, and in some cases death follows. During the suppression of the Hock Lee Bus Company riots, 2 protesters were killed and 4 injured. The government followed up with a strong response. Bus workers were calling for a strike, and it was a terrible mess. David Marshall and Lee Kuan Yew were able to work together to turn down the heat with the bus company union negotiators. Fired workers were reinstated. Lee and Marshall shared some common ground with the Malayan Communist Party, but not enough to be branded too left-leaning. Whereas the elites in government would have nothing to do with communists, Lee talked to them. The far left-leaning elements, the labor unions, leftist organizations, students, the disaffected. Lee Kuan Yew recognized if he was going to establish this PAP as a mass party that was embraced by the masses, he had to build a broad coalition. The Labor Front didn't seem to be doing this. In November of 1954, the PAP held its inaugural meeting at Victoria Memorial Hall, now called the Victoria Concert Hall. Now, he'll get rid of them later, but to get his party up and running, elected, making a difference, pushing for changes, and becoming a front runner, the PAP needed to do what they needed to do. And this included, initially, linking arms with those who they wouldn't be caught dead with later on. The Labor Front, led by David Marshall, on the other hand, they weren't as politically savvy as the PAP, and part of the reason for their future failure was due to this reason. Since they shared much in common, Marshall had been counting on joining forces with the PAP in a coalition and having their resources to help him too. But Lee Kuan Yew, he was a very smooth operator and far too clever to be some junior coalition member in Marshall's Labor Front. He wisely chose to become an opposition party instead. In choosing this path, Lee and Marshall, the PAP and LF, became political opponents. As the PAP campaigned throughout Singapore for the upcoming 1955 election, Marshall knew he had been had. Unhappy with the outcome, he ended up resigning from the LF that he helped found. He remained politically engaged, but sort of got sidelined early on in modern Singapore's history, outmaneuvered by Lee Kuan Yew. Marshall simply wasn't as good a politician, but his heart was in the right place, and he did play a role in mainstreaming Singapore's multilingual education system and for promoting multiracialism in general. So I hope you could appreciate what was riding on this 1955 election. It was a pretty big deal. The press and many politicians and public figures had gone above and beyond the call of duty to fan the flames under the always simmering pot of racial tension between Chinese, Malay, and Indian residents of Singapore. Small though the Crown Colony of Singapore may have been, and they still had the same sensitive and emotive issues as the big nations. Lee Kuan Yew was the Secretary General of his People's Action Party and its main spokesperson. His inner circle had been meeting regularly at his residence on Oxley Rise, planning and strategizing, and getting so close to activists such as Lim Chin Siong and Fong Swee Suan was a bit of a risk for Lee Kuan Yew. But for the time being, they were politically useful and offered the PAP wide popular support going into the 1955 election. On April 2nd, 1955, the election was held for the new Legislative Assembly. The thing about this election that made it important was that most of the seats were to be elected and not appointed by the government. Marshall's Labor Front won 10 of the 17 seats they went for, and Marshall was made the chief minister. The PAP had only won 3 seats, but had only contested 4. The British thought the Progressive Party was going to sweep the elections, but they only won 4 of the 18 seats they contested. This 1955 election would go on to become the only one in Singapore's history where a coalition government had to be formed and where no one single party controlled the legislature. And though nobody knew it at the time, it was the only election that wasn't won handily by the People's Action Party. One thing of note was that Lee Kuan Yew won his seat in the Tanjong Pagar constituency, and he held that seat for the next 60 years, all the way up until his passing in 2015. Only slightly more than half of the electorate in Singapore showed up to vote. Voting will become mandatory later on, but David Marshall's Labor Front, though finishing with the most seats, were unable to claim a majority, and he'll have a most unpleasant time as chief minister, resigning the following year, 1956. The PAP began its rise here. Singapore was one step closer to independence. From their modest gains in the 1955 election, they continued to position themselves as the party who spoke out for the workers and the dispossessed. Compared to today, they were quite radical back then. Lee Kuan Yew risked being slotted with the radicals, so he had to also assure the British, the upper class, the educated elites, and the Singapore bourgeoisie that he was also one of them. The next big milestone as far as Singapore's future independence were the April 1956 constitutional talks held in London. Marshall went into those talks swinging punches and vociferously pushed hard for the elected government to not only control the legislature, but the matter of Singapore's defense, internal security, and law enforcement. The British colonial authorities had one major problem with Marshall, and that was his fondness for far left-leaning politics. Marshall wasn't going to back down on what were his core beliefs, and therein lie the rub. These April 1956 London talks to prepare for full internal self-government for Singapore ended in failure. And as I just mentioned, when Marshall couldn't get his way, he resigned in June that year as chief minister, just as he said he would. Succeeding him was the deputy chief minister, Lim Yew Hock. He served in this position until 1959. Lim had begun as a Progressive Party member who joined with David Marshall to co-found the Labour Front. Like Lee Kuan Yew later on, he's going to recognize the political taint that all the labor unions, leftists, and communists gave his efforts to fight for Singapore independence. Not the British government, nor Stamford Raffles and William Farquhar, if they were alive, wanted to leave Singapore in such volatile and untrustworthy hands as the communists. So Lim Yew Hock, in one of his first actions as the new chief minister, under British pressure, launched a crackdown on leftist student and worker organizations. The most high-profile crackdown came against PAP co-founder Lim Chin Siong. This stance, being tough on the more radical leftists and communists, was more what the British wanted to see, and in doing what he did, Lim Yew Hock was able to earn the trust that Marshall had been unable to obtain. A second round of constitutional negotiations were held that led to the 1958 State of Singapore Agreement. The meat of this agreement gave Singapore full internal self-government with only defense and foreign affairs left in British hands. Lim Yew Hock, once Lee Kuan Yew takes center stage in 1959, will slowly fade from the leadership. But in Singapore history, at least, he's remembered for his role in the final steps to independence. By this time, in the late 1950s, the matter of Singapore's self-rule and independence was already a sure thing. It was just a matter of when and how. Some were less patient than others. A mass rally was planned at Kallang Airport on March 18, 1956. A bunch of politicians and leaders on the left were going to give speeches. It attracted massive crowds who showed up in the morning to listen to guys like David Marshall, Lee Kuan Yew, Lim Chin Siong, and another early PAP stalwart, Ong Eng Guan. Just before David Marshall got up to speak, the crowd, already in the mood for blowing off some steam, rushed the stage and it collapsed. And what followed was the kind of chaos you see at a rock concert going haywire. All hell broke loose and some people started rioting and throwing bricks at police and exhibiting violent resistance against law enforcement. Well, the disturbance was quelled, but from this free-for-all, everyone on the right who was insisting Singapore still wasn't ready for independence pointed at this incident as all the proof that was needed. The masses were still too unruly and not showing the kind of behavior that is expected in a democracy. Still a mob at heart, and mobs could be manipulated for political ends. Whether or not they were to blame, the riots at Kallang Airport were pinned on communist agitators. And if you zoom out to stratospheric levels, you have to keep in mind, mid to late 1950s, the Red Scare was wafting around more places than the U.S. of A. With an obvious communist presence feeding off the popular dissatisfaction with the government, the homegrown political parties, they had to play this one right. There's an old Chinese saying, Jin zhu zhe chi, Jin mo zhe hei. If you stick close to red, meaning good folks, you'll become vermilion. If you stick with ink-colored, meaning bad peeps, you'll become black. You are the company you keep. And remaining friendly and collegial with the far left, especially with what was still going on all up and down the Malay Peninsula, it wasn't such a good thing. And Lee Kuan Yew knew this and made his break with the left. He carried out a purge and steered the PAP course to a center-right direction instead. And with Marshall under attack for his role in the disaster at Kallang Airport, his enemies and rivals piled on and in so many words called him inept and the one to blame for this homegrown insurgency. And Lee Kuan Yew, too. Right when that bandwagon passed his house, he, too, jumped on and added his voice to the crowd. Marshall would end up resigning a few months after the disturbance at Kallang Airport. Lee Kuan Yew was able to take in the big picture and read the mood. And through his steely nerve and calming words, he was able to quiet things down. And this didn't go unnoticed by the British, who saw in Lee Kuan Yew someone who spoke their language. Midway through the 1950s, Singapore wasn't such a peaceful place. After all the political agitation and riling up the people, and after coming this far in the elections, a political awakening had blossomed across Singapore. More and more acts of civil disobedience occurred. Many protests turned into riots. Lives continued to be lost and people injured. Curfews got imposed. And when things began to get too dicey, the British sent troops down from Malaya into Singapore, just in case. By peeling the left wing of the party away from the PAP, Lee Kuan Yew knew he was going to be raked over the coals. He had willingly teamed up with them for the sake of political expediency back in 1954. But now, in 1956, he decided to get rid of them and take his lumps with those PAP supporters on the left. And they sure went after Lee. The blowback was such that he had to reconsider his actions. But when the chief minister, Lim Yew Hock, doubled down on government-led anti-leftist actions, all the public ire was turned on him. And Lee Kuan Yew just sat back and let Lim Yew Hock do the job for him, arresting all the leftist leaders. As we've seen, especially in recent decades, protesters don't always get what they want and are sometimes beaten down by the heavy hand of government intervention. So with the leftist political leaders like Lim Chin Siong and Fong Swee Suan arrested or marginalized, this whole faction in government took a big hit, and it made things much more convenient for Lee to proceed with purging them from the PAP and to quickly consolidate his position as the leader of the party and shape its future in his image. And as I said, the British had faith in Lee Kuan Yew. And they were now more in the mood to speed things up with respect to the pace of independence and constitutional reforms. And after the test elections of 1948 and 1955, showing promising results, new elections were called for May 1959 in Singapore. And if you thought the 1955 election opened up voting to the Singaporean people, for the election of 1959, even more people were able to register. In 1957, after the passing of the Singapore Citizenship Ordinance, 260,000 alien Chinese residing in Singapore without the right to vote could now participate. It had been said that all those born in Singapore or the Federation of Malaya were eligible to become Singapore citizens, and those who resided in Singapore for 10 years or more were eligible for citizenship by naturalization. And Lee Kuan Yew had a pretty good feeling about which way this election was going to head. Remember how I said earlier how Lee Kuan Yew never learned to speak his ancestral Hakka language, nor Mandarin? Well, now he had to. If he wanted to connect with his supporters and his potential Chinese-speaking voters, he had to learn it. He already spoke fluent Malay. Mr. Lee's Mandarin was often the butt of a lot of jokes. Let's just say no one ever mistook him for someone who came from Beijing. Well, who likes long drawn-out elections? Let's cut to the chase and go straight to the results. For this historic 1959 election in Singapore, on May 30th, 1959, a day after I unknowingly celebrated my Manuet over in Chicago, Lee Kuan Yew and his People's Action Party won by a landslide. 43 of 51 seats in the Legislative Assembly went to their candidates, and with that, Lee Kuan Yew became the first elected prime minister in Singapore history, and the aspiration of the Singaporean people to become a self-governing nation came one step closer. In June of 1959, on the steps of City Hall, Lee Kuan Yew declared Singapore's Merdeka, or independence. The new flag was unveiled, a crimson and white background with 5 stars and a crescent moon, and the new national anthem was sung, the Majulah Singapura, Onward Singapore. Things started to move much quicker now. The communist insurgency, known as the Malayan Emergency of 1948 to 1960, was winding down. The communists had done well in China, but after a long, protracted struggle, the British and Commonwealth forces were able to beat them back. The anti-communist sentiment was very strong in Malaya and was best represented in the Tunku, Abdul Rahman. He was a giant of his time and served as UMNO's second president, chief minister of Malaya, and the first prime minister of Malaysia. He's forever remembered as Malaysia's father of independence, or Bapa Kemerdekaan. Tunku is a hereditary royal title, especially in Kedah State, where Abdul Rahman came from. He was the 7th son of Sultan Abdul Hamid Halim Shah, the 25th Sultan of Kedah. Tunku Abdul Rahman's words carried a lot of weight, and he was an extreme anti-communist. And when he saw all this leftist agitation going on in Singapore, and politicians such as Lee Kuan Yew and David Marshall getting too close to them, he shared this fear with the British that the communists might end up taking over in Singapore. What added urgency to this fear was that, 230 miles away from downtown Miami, Florida, on January 1st, 1959, Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista and his government had only recently fallen to the communist forces led by Fidel Castro. And the Tunku and a lot of others were terrified that Singapore might become their own Cuba, right on their doorstep. In July of 1961, as a gesture of reconciliation, Lee Kuan Yew, after making them sign on to this PAP manifesto and obtaining assurances that they wouldn't cause any trouble or take actions against the government, released many of the jailed leftists who had been languishing in Changi prison. The Tunku, he didn't like that, and for good reason, too. In doing what he did, Lee miscalculated, and his rivals, led by Lim Chin Siong and David Marshall, turned on him and went on the attack. With Lee on his back foot, all of his political enemies piled on. And the Tunku, up in Kuala Lumpur, was not liking what he was seeing, and his worst fears of having another Cuba on his hands seemed possible. The left faction of the PAP, though they were once favorable to a merger with Malaya, were now solidly against it. They knew, post-merger, the Tunku was going to arrest them, and they saw in Prime Minister Abdul Rahman a formidable foe. So they were not for a merger and fought tooth and nail with Lee's faction of the PAP to oppose it. When the April 1961 by-elections were called, Lee's PAP suffered a humiliating loss. After enjoying the fruits of his 1959 election triumph, Lee Kuan Yew's whole political career witnessed a stunning reversal of fortune and suddenly was teetering on the brink, and there were calls for him to resign. He had taken full responsibility for the loss of the 2 seats to the opposition. And then Lee saw an opening when, at the end of May 1961, at the Singapore Press Club, the Tunku gave his famous Grand Design speech. With the recent turn of events, with the 1961 by-elections, the Tunku's fear of having a PRC satellite country right on his doorstep seemed imminent. And for this main reason, to preempt such a thing from happening, he called for a merger with Singapore. The Tunku's grand design called for the merger to include the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, and to add some extra Malay numbers to the total population. The Borneo territories of Sabah and Sarawak would join as part of the Greater Malaysia. Lee Kuan Yew initially gave this grand design his thumbs up. He had his own reasons for wanting this, which we'll get to in the next episode. The British weren't too keen on the idea, as they were still holding out to maintain Singapore as their independent Cold War base in Asia. And in Singapore, there was still this nagging doubt among many about whether or not the tiny island could go it alone in the world. They didn't have the benefit back in 1961 of knowing what they know today in 2024. And next time in Part 8, we'll see what happens with the merger and the events immediately leading up to the historic referendum and what followed. So please consider coming back to see what happens next. A special thanks to longtime listener and Patreon supporter in Singapore, Eng Guan, for his assistance with this episode. Thanks, Mr. Go. And until the next time, when we'll meet again, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California, sending all of you my deepest and most profound thanks for listening. And as I often do from time to time, I am beseeching you to come back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.